Hello and good morning. My name is Selena Dorme. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation here in North Vancouver and the Engagement Coordinator for the First Nations Public Service Secretariat. We are back for another webinar. Today is Webinar Wednesday, and today's webinar is going to be on managing the new economic realities for First Nations as they're dealing with COVID-19 right now at this very uncertain time. We have two speakers here today. We have Chief David Jimmie from Squiala First Nation, and we have Chief Commissioner Manny Jules from the First Nations Tax Commission. Unfortunately, Chief Manny Jules is unable to join through video, so he is only, you can only hear him today and unfortunately not see him. We also have Bronwyn Geddes, who is working with the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, working in the back end to answer any specific questions you can put in our group chat. To submit your questions that you want answered live, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Once our speakers are done, we're going to move over to that section and start answering your questions live. Or you can also submit your questions into the group chat as well. Just keep in mind that everybody can see those. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Chief David Jimmie to get us started.
Well, everybody. Chief David Jimmie coming from Squiala First Nation this morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak and share a little bit about the current situation that we find ourselves in. Unprecedented times for sure. There's challenges with respect to community support, to everything in managing staff, how we are engaging with our businesses, and part of what I wanted to chat about this morning or just talk about was the impacts that we're seeing with our businesses. So how do we manage through such a challenging time, and we're not able to, we're seeing every business at every level being affected. So from governance and tax collection to, if we operate a large commercial retail center, Eagle Landing, as many people know, and come through Chilliwack to stop and fuel up or grab something on the road. So our business, our main source of income and being commercial retail, has had a significant impact. And what we have to do in order to address it properly is really work with everybody. So we're then working with our the lenders. Obviously, when we built the site, we had to go out and borrow to build and then fill the site as we continued on. And so, we have all of our lease agreements in place. The challenge that you find is suddenly, without doors being open, can businesses actually live up to the agreements and be able to pay their full lease rates? It's not going to happen. Everybody is affected. So the best thing to do in those situations, or in any situation, whether it's commercial retail or whatever the business may be, and the sort of economic income and impact here, is to open the lines of communication as soon as possible. So for us in our situation, it's reaching out to all of our tenants. They are the first to actually engage with us because they know what's coming. And then, talking with our lenders, knowing that, we can't even put accurate cash flow projections together because you don't know what's coming in the next few months. We know for the month of April, we had some obligations, so you're trying to do as best you can. So you open the door, you start having the conversations with the lenders, you start having conversations with your tenants, start having conversations with the municipality if you have a services agreement in place too, because your obligations to collect and pay taxes with the service agreement is another aspect. So there's so many different challenges in managing all of it. It really has been a lot of work staying on top of it with daily calls, meeting with our partners, and constant contact with the tenants. So there's some fear, like, even for those borrowing, and we know that there's some programs out there for support for businesses that have, had significant impacts between $50,000 and $1 million that are paying payroll. But it's not enough because, you look at some of those support programs and it's only going to be $40,000 if you qualify. So is $40,000 going to cover payroll? Is it going to be 75% of your wage that you can offer out without providing work? So you're forced with and faced with another challenge. So all of these things lead to full cooperation by everybody, from, our role as, chief and council for governance within the community. My role specifically is CEO for the band, so I manage all of our businesses and still in charge of operations. You're having to start to think about, having people work remotely from home and then monitoring that. So another challenge, like we're seeing within the school districts, how do you monitor? And the requirement for teachers is a good example of how we can do a bit more to ensure that, no community wants to be paying people to do nothing. So you have to address that issue. So the economics around collection of money that provide for our community, our own source programs that we run in the community depend on those finances. So it's been, the first few weeks were extremely challenging. I also find that it's difficult to meet expectations. I think that's just a given in any leadership role for communities. A lot of us know that your own community is one of the hardest places to work. And, when people, and it's, the communication is so important with membership, because you hear announcements from Trudeau on, 305 million and these numbers that come out, but to most of our citizens, they're not understanding that, how many communities do we have in Canada and how large are some of those communities. So when they're doing the, trying to figure out exactly how much they're giving each community, it's based on population, based on remoteness, based on need. So there's a number of factors, but if you're not communicating that to the community, you can expect a little, some unhappy people, and that's tough to do, especially when you're planning for the long haul, because we know it's not going to end tomorrow, and the funding that's come in is not going to last forever. So we can't spend it all at once. And when we're looking at the most vulnerable and elderly in the community, we have to ensure that we're looking out for those interests and trying to support as much as we can. Getting a little sidetracked there with community stuff, but I think the biggest piece for understanding the current situation and where everybody is at in your own community is, first of all, knowing what resources are available for the community. It's tough if you're a landlord because nothing's been developed yet. It's establishing the relationship with the municipality to see if there are any tax breaks coming. Like we know City of Vancouver has been looking at it, I think has done something. And then talking with lenders. So there's multiple steps in order to address the issue. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to demonstrate, if you're requesting relief, exactly why you're requesting it. So there's going to be a lot of information that has to be relayed to lenders in our case that says, okay, here's how much we collected for the month of April. Here's what our normal collections would look like. Here's, they want some projections for next month, which is next to impossible. It's safe to say it's not going to be the same as what we collected in April. So I think at the end of the day, it's really about communication and understanding all of the impacts before you can start your planning. But getting the planning done and having those conversations until you have something established with the lenders and the tenants and the agreements, you're not going to know what you're working towards. I'll leave it at that. I think I went for my 5-7 minutes there, and open it up to questions or pass it on to Manny.
It seems as though we've lost Chief Commissioner Manny Jules while you were talking. Oh, then he's back. Okay, little technical difficulties. Hello, Manny, are you back with us?
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I just got cut off.
Okay. Oh, well, just in time, because Chief David Jimmie had just wrapped up, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, the first message is everyone has to be safe. Our forefathers, our ancestors have lived through many, many pandemics in the past. As a matter of fact, in 1491, there were more here in the Americas people than in Europe. We've lived through smallpox, tuberculosis, Spanish flu. But one of the things I've been following very closely developments in the United States because it's very similar, of course, to us. Here, many tribal governments don't have a tax base. There are no property tax. There are no they're not generating money for taxes. The only revenue generated tribal governments is from business. So when you pull that rug out from under us, we have nothing. And that's what's happening, and Chief David Jimmie talked about it. Most of our governments, and there are two fundamental things for a government: land and taxes, TAKSIS. Otherwise, we're going to be paper governments. We're going to be dependent on someone else. So when I think about what happened particularly during the smallpox epidemic of 1862-63, this was at a critical moment in colonial history here in British Columbia. And that weakened us to the extent we couldn't really literally fight if we chose to fight. And that meant that the way was open for British Columbia and the colonial government to colonize us. And that's what we're facing right now. We're still dealing with the Indian Act. The Indian Act must go after this. We can no longer use it as a crutch. And so the most important thing right now is for our health, and then thinking about the future for the economics and the fiscal reasons. And when you look at health issues, all of us in our communities have the underlying conditions that mean that this could go rampant through our communities: diabetes, heart and respiratory conditions, overcrowded housing, intergenerational housing with elders. And so one of the things about our economics is that we've been very successful in capitalizing on loopholes in businesses, casinos in particular, tobacco, cannabis, and giving deals to companies. Not a strong investment climate. We're missing tax powers, we're missing infrastructure, we're missing legal frameworks, we're missing a land title system and administrations that other jurisdictions in Canada take for granted. The result is a much higher cost of getting things done and less access to capital. First Nations economies, and it's being demonstrated as I've been looking and working with communities right across the country, are more vulnerable to COVID-19. And there will be more business and more employment losses. There's no question in my mind there are going to be bankruptcies. It's going to affect our daily take in terms of our business income. It's going to affect the taxes, as we've already seen right across the country. Some communities are on the verge of going insolvent within a couple of weeks. And so one of the things we've got to do in looking at the fiscal issues, the First Nations have the least tax power of any government. The federal government has the most. That's why everybody is asking them to use their credit rating to help us during the COVID-19 pandemic. First Nations are in line with everybody else. Businesses, lost employment, renters, mortgagers, local and provincial governments. First Nations fiscal revenues could be hit the hardest. And when David was just talking about the city of Vancouver and the breaks, they're on the verge of bankruptcy. A couple of provinces have already indicated they're on a short leash. Manitoba, in particular, they've written a letter to the federal government saying that, potentially within 5 months they could be bankrupt. And so we're behind all of those other players. And part of the problem is that we've been creating paper governments. As I mentioned, two things are critical to be a government. Land, the federal government, if you don't have a treaty, the federal government owns all Indian reserves. That has to change. We have to have our own land title system. That land has to be transferred to our collective interest. We have to have a proper land title system. The other thing that's critically important is we need taxes. As I mentioned, we have the least amount of fiscal powers. And the reason why everybody's looking at the federal government is they can go to the international market and use their credit rating. And that's what we're going to be floating on for the next, probably until there's a vaccine. So it's going to be Yes?
No, sorry, you had cut out there just for a second. Go ahead and continue. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So just to wrap up, we've got about 2 more years of this. So we're going to see a lot of unpleasant things happening within that time. We have to work with the federal government. We have to work with First Nations to replace lost tax revenue and business revenues. We've currently sent a proposal for the tax revenues and provided a submission to the federal government. We were hoping that it was going to be included in the budget. So we'll know within a week or so of a program that hopefully will be announced. We have to be able to develop a sustainable economy for the future, build more durable economic infrastructure faster. I'm advocating a First Nations Infrastructure Institute. I've indicated to the federal government we have to move on that as quickly as possible so that we're part of the rebuilding of our economies and using that potential as an economic stimulus within our communities. We have to expand our fiscal powers for the future, not only fuel, alcohol, cannabis, and tobacco and excise taxes, resource taxes, other taxes, and income tax. And not paying a tax, in my view, this is for our members, is hoarding. We have to be able to start sharing our wealth so that we're looking after, as we've always said, our most vulnerable in our communities. Right now, we've got our hand out to the federal government, and that has to change. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is by dealing with it through our strengthening of our institutions. We have to build a new land title system to increase access to capital and lower the cost of doing business and develop economic capacity through our center, which we call Tulo, which is a Chinook word meaning profit. So that's what I've got to say in a nutshell, so I'm prepared to answer questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Chief Manny Jules. Really appreciate both of you being here today. We do have a couple of questions that have been submitted in the group chat so far. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. Let's see. And either both of you can speak on these questions, or it really just depends on your preference. The first question is, have you started looking at longer term planning to deliver community services with potentially less own source revenue?
David?
Oh, sorry. There we go.
David, are you going to answer that?
Yeah, I can go. I was muted, so I was just talking to myself. So we're looking at, like right now, given the current situation, we're sort of planning to get through until the end of summer, and we're expecting, our significant impacts to the businesses at least till June, July. And so our revenue streams, we've been fairly cautious in our savings for the community and our investments. So we're okay to continue to offer or provide the services back to community for a certain amount of time. We'll have to revisit once we get too far along, but essentially we don't want to start changing anything. A lot of our membership depends on the services we provide. We have 30 somewhat program policies for support, like new baby support, elder support, recreation and travel support, sports and recreation, education, post-secondary, plus tech and trade. So the list goes on and on for providing, and a lot of members where we've got single mothers that are raising their children depend on that monthly supplement that we provide for them to help So, recognizing the importance of continuing to provide all of those additional services over and above what they can get elsewhere. We want to maintain what we're doing for now. We may have to look at certain services. We probably have to identify throughout a list of what sort of prioritize what would be most important for membership support, and then start taking away that way when we have to deal with it. But that's our plan for now.
And for the Fiscal Management Act institutions, what we're proposing to the federal government is that they help us replace obviously the potential of lost tax revenue and also business revenue, and also giving more room and flexibility through those that have borrowed through FNFA, the First Nations Finance Authority. And through that, we're hoping to have more liquidity, more cash ready and available for First Nations to prioritize in the short term what needs to happen. In the longer term, when these valves start to shut off, we need to have as many of the institutions as possible up and running. Like I say, the Land Title System, the Infrastructure Institute, because if we miss that opportunity, which is going to be part of the rebuilding strategy of the government, federally and provincially and municipally, we're going to miss out on an incredible opportunity. And the reason I say that is because we work with the Maoris on the South Island of New Zealand, and what their discussions are with the New Zealand government is exactly that kind of a strategy, which they used after the earthquake in 2011, is using infrastructure building as a part of an economic stimulus package. And when you look at the infrastructure deficit we've got, it's upwards of 40 billion, and after this, it'll probably be, 100 billion. And so one of the partners that we've been reaching out and considering very closely is the First Nations Health Authority here in British Columbia, so that we can begin to, using the trickle-down effect. But that's my thoughts on what we can do in the short term and how we have to start thinking about the longer term, because the longer term is going to become pretty immediate very quickly.
Great. Thank you both so much. The next question is for Chief David Jimmie. As a CEO of the band operated business, do you plan on then coming back to full operations, and how are you planning for that?
We're going to follow provincial guidelines and respect, again, as Manny stated in his opening statement, that our first priority is that everybody is safe and everybody is healthy. So we're providing essential services right now. We still have people going in and out of the office at different times. We monitor and ensure that we're only having, 4 people max at a time that are there. They're keeping their social distancing in effect. But we still have to process checks. We still have to have people come in and pick them up. We have to think of ways that we're dealing with that. So gloves, masks, preparing food hampers, we get a few more hands on deck to go and do that, but again, with every precaution. So at some point, yes, full operations, but it's going to be in a different nature. And I think we may end up looking at splitting the day. So, it'll be listed for community members that know we have days that people are coming in and out. We've got a front office reception area that's got, the front and the glass. So we're contemplating having, certain staff members that have to deal directly with membership to go down and sit themselves in that office and have the doors wide open. We're just trying to get creative and figure out how we can still do things and manage effectively. But for now, it's going to be just, people, again, the challenge of having people work remotely from home, and the monitoring is daily calls. We're down to 3 days a week, so we're going Monday, Wednesday, Friday calls, updates on what everybody's working on, trying to determine if those hours are accurate. It's a little different when we're not a for-profit organization that solely depends on revenue streams. The band operated business is separate, and as opposed to what we receive in government funding. So it's definitely a challenge, and we're looking at how we'll be able to bring everybody back on board. But I think it's going to be a bit of a staggered approach. And if we can see this curve flattening more and more, you know, I think the misconception from membership is that it should be open. We should be available for service. Everybody's available by email. My phone's on, you know, 24/7 regardless. So everybody knows if they need something, they can call and ask, and we're doing the best we can to make sure that everybody's still receiving services. But full operations, I think we're still a little ways away from that.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Chief Manny Jules. What do you think Chief and Council should be doing to get ready for what comes after this? Planning for proposals or investments?
Well, that's a very good question. I believe what we should be doing as governments, band governments right across the country, is lobbying for the kinds of institutions that I've outlined. Because if we don't have the institutional capability, we're going to be further behind the rest of the Canadian economy. So just to reinforce it, I'm hopeful that we can, all of us, support as our ancestors did in presentations to Oliver, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs in the 1910 document called the Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial. We called on the federal government then to have our own land title system so that we can look after our ranch and they can look after theirs. We called on the government to work with us so that each of us will be great and good. One of my own priorities is to make sure that we've got an infrastructure institute. We're just about ready to, we've been doing all of the modeling. We've been looking at how the legislation would actually work. And that way, the federal government would be in a position to monetize federal transfers to communities. And so I impeach all of you, implore on all of you to support these kinds of initiatives, because then it would help us hit the ground more quickly, because otherwise, you know, it's going to be the waiting game again. But Chief and Council have to be looking at, as the economy is going to drastically change, it's akin to, but not quite like the Great Depression. It's more like what happened after Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in 2008. You've got a whole bunch of businesses that really, after that, became redundant. I don't know what kind of redundancy is going to take place in our communities, meaning the businesses and how business operates. That's going to be a challenge. Like, as an example, people aren't going in as much to grocery stores. So that's going to change because of distancing that we're going to have to maintain until there's a vaccine. A vaccine obviously is going to be a year to a year and a half, maybe sooner, we all hope. But it's going to be at least a couple of years, I think, before everything kind of gets back to a new normal. And the new normal isn't going to be what we dealt with in February and previously. The new normal is going to be completely different. Business meetings aren't going to take place the way they have been in the past. There aren't going to be large gatherings. So you have to kind of creatively think about how your community fits into that equation, how you're going to have to build and rebuild the economy to meet those urgent needs of your community, but how you're going to have to be able to respond to the new economic reality, which I say is going to be completely different. The important thing there, I believe, is that once the federal government turns off the taps, it's our communities on a national basis that are going to really be affected and very quickly. And you could see it happening in the United States because of a lot of the communities being completely reliant on casinos, as an example. All of those have shut down. And so they're going to have a diverse economy, and that's a lesson for us. When we move into this new reality, we can't be just dependent on a small number of businesses. We have to be able to pool our resources as communities right across the country so that we can look after collectively those communities who are most vulnerable and be able to talk to the federal and provincial governments over having an orderly vacating of tax room. I'm a strong proponent of the Canadian federal tax system. What has to happen is that the federal and provincial governments have to have an orderly vacating of that room so that we can orderly occupy it and begin to look after ourselves. So there's a myriad of different approaches. I know I concentrate a lot on the tax room, but that's critically important part of government. And then as far as the businesses, you're going to have to be looking at, as I mentioned, the new reality. And it isn't like, February. This is going to be a completely different economy that we'll have to function under. And we'll have to really think, and this is going to take all of our collective thought, all of our collective will to be able to work together and break down those economic barriers that have prevented us from participating fully in the Canadian economy and therefore the global economy. And you can see it happening with masks. There's going to be a complete shift away from the complete dependence on China to provide ventilators and masks. You can see it happening with Trudeau's initiatives. That's the kind of thinking that we've got to do, and we've got to be quick on our feet to do it, because if we don't, we're going to be left behind, and lives depend on it.
Thank you, Chief Jules. There's a few more questions in the queue, and we have about 10 minutes left. So the next question is there any support for First Nation owned, operated businesses beyond supports offered to all Canadian businesses? Is your First Nation planning to offer your members that own their own business any extra support?
As far as I know, there's no additional funding available for First Nations other than what's been offered to all Canadians. We haven't looked at providing support yet. I think we've got a bigger challenge in trying to manage what is going to be coming in here for the next little while. If it was a business that was operating within our development, we would definitely be working with them just as we're working with everybody. Deferral of payments, maybe looking at just paying CAM and taxes instead of, the full base rent option. So we can look at different things to provide support, but at this point, we don't have any programs in place, and we're going to be taking a pretty massive hit here in the next few months on the larger scale of operations. So once we have a better handle on what kind of relief we're going to get from lenders that we can in turn do back to our tenants, then we'll have a better idea to sort of plan moving forward. But as of right now, we don't.
So before they shut everything down in March, I took a long walk in Vancouver. I happened to be at a meeting that was canceled, and I thought initially then that we'd better, as the FMA institutions, write a letter to the ministers, the two ministers of Indian Affairs and the Minister of Finance, firstly extending a hand of goodwill and cooperation, reminding them that our ancestors talked about each of us helping one another so that we would be great and good. And that was the first, salvo, if you will. The next one that we worked on with the FMA institutions is a multi-billion-dollar package that would include lost tax revenues as well as business revenues that we hopefully will be announced in the next little bit. I don't know to what extent the federal government is going to announce a program or how much it will be, but those initiatives we took on ourselves, and we said these are going to be critically important. And the reason was, obviously, it was obvious to us that we were going to lose tax revenues because people weren't going to be coming in and paying it. People were going to be worried about their health. We knew that there was a huge reliance on the business streams to augment community services. As a matter of fact, we've been looking at, Enoch as an example, are on the verge of bankruptcy. Member 2 in Nova Scotia, which is one of the shining lights of First Nations economies, is balancing on a pinhead, if you will, in terms of insolvency. And so we knew that was happening. We let the federal government know that. We did analysis right across the country looking at the potential. Just as a further example, in Manitoba, Ontario, a lot of the communities are reliant on cottagers for their leases and lease incomes. Of course, a lot of communities have now shut down their borders, telling cottagers they can't come in and visit their leasehold properties. That means that they're not going to be able to have lease revenue coming in, as well as potential tax revenue loss. And so those are going to be getting bigger. We let the federal government know that we're prepared to work with them as closely as possible to augment, the situation. But our priority is to make sure that our communities have got as much liquid cash as possible to provide, firstly, for the healthcare, but in the longer term, imploring on the government to move as quickly for institutional building as possible.
Thank you so much. The next question is, I guess there's not a clear understanding, but is the Infrastructure Institute the same as Land Code? I'm actually not too sure what that either.
No, they're completely separate. What I've been proposing is a national First Nations Infrastructure Institute, so that, as you know, the federal government, you can negotiate up to 10 years for a water system, and then you get it built, and it all has to be built within 1 or 2 fiscal years. What we've been proposing to the federal government is let's see if we can create a national institution that would facilitate real infrastructure built to be business ready. And that means, having a proper water system that not only applies to your members, but also those that you want to encourage to do business. You want to do business with. There are limitations under the existing federal program to do that. We're also suggesting to the federal government this would be a way to monetize transfers to First Nations, so that instead of building, one water system, we could be looking at, multi-water systems right across the country. Looking at group homes, looking at housing developments, all of those things, if we work together, we'll be able to provide billions of dollars worth of stimulus. And that's what the Infrastructure Institute is all about, helping First Nations build business-ready infrastructure to look after themselves, make sure there's potable water, making sure there's sewer systems, road networks, high-speed internet, as an example, is another area that we've been applying a lot of our attention to, because that's important. The information highway is critically important, but also health. And that's why I mentioned working ultimately with the British Columbia Health Authority, because then we could look at building multiples of health facilities in our communities. And if you translate that across the country, that means hundreds of millions and then billions of dollars, which are going to be required in our communities. When you deal with the land code, that means that you're working with the First Nations lands management to come up with a code to govern how you lease, how you transfer land within your reserve, descent of property, all of those other things. So this is meant to create, the Infrastructure Institute is meant to create a business climate so that we can compete on a more level playing field with other jurisdictions.
Thank you, Chief Manny. There's one more question because we have just a few minutes left. And it's a question, they said, this isn't really business related, but we're moving into the spring. It's construction season in most of our country. What do you think will happen with capital projects and whether or not they would move forward?
I think construction season is all year round. I own a construction company as well, and we've been trying to get our trades to complete projects. We've got a few still going. It's been a bit of a challenge even in the community where we are building a few new units, and we had members saying, you know, we shouldn't be finishing these off. Like, we shouldn't have people coming and going out of the community when the Prime Minister is talking, and the you know, we were looking at Dr. Bonnie Henry saying all of these things about social distancing, they shouldn't be coming. And I had to explain, well, you know, we have obligations to members that are moving into these units that have given their notice where they are. And so we have to continue and finish. New projects, you know, essential services, when we look at electricians, plumbers, and others in trades that are still providing the service, have been recognized as an essential service. The Construction Association has said, although at this point they're not saying no to any new construction, they're saying yes, continue on, ensure that you're following proper guidelines. It's a bit different because, you know, in some cases you can have various trades working in isolation at, you know, certain times, or in very, you know, different parts of the project. But I do think that we're still going to see capital projects going, because a lot of, especially with civil trades or civil work, a lot of these businesses have everything lined up. Funding has been in place for a while. They'll continue to provide that and get those done. So I think we'll still see projects moving along for now, as long as we don't see a huge spike in cases in BC. I think we're still going to continue to see those projects moving.
Thank you. Chief Manny, anything you'd like to add to that before we close up?
Well, I think it's really important that, you know, David was talking about Dr. Bonnie Henry. You know, she's giving sage words of advice, and that's going to impact economically on how we undertake projects and how we move forward. I believe that a lot of the projects, as Chief Jimmie was talking about, are actually very critical to carry on. You can't not repair a roof. You can't not deal with plumbing. So, you know, keeping a distance, making sure that health and safety are paramount, projects have to carry on. And people have to, you know, and that has a stimulus in and of itself. And so, but we're impacted. We have to follow provincial guidelines. They're going to be a little bit different right across the country. But here in British Columbia, we have to listen to the, you know, what the provincial government's got to say about construction projects. And as a matter of fact, the unions, a lot of times the unions have been voicing their concerns as well. One of my most paramount concerns, and I'm sure if you've got a mother or a grandmother, as I have a mother in an elder's facility, making sure that that facility is staffed, that people aren't walking off the job because of the potential of COVID-19. And that highlights the fact that we have to be able to build the institutions to look after ourselves. We can't depend on somebody else because their interests are not completely aligned with ours.
Thank you both so much. I want to make a point of sharing some of the nice comments and questions that were submitted. From Carolyn Sampson, thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. Thank you for coordinating this. From Carlene George, chatting with Chief Chad, and the work you guys are doing is going to bring long-term benefits for future generations and is one avenue that we can utilize. So keep up the good work. Thank you so much for that. And from Deborah Taylor, do you think this crisis is enough to drive First Nation governments to work together to become a joint force to be treated equally by the feds and the province? And Chief Manny Jules, I think you kind of really covered that in this whole entire webinar and really hit the nail on the head with that. And it is definitely, we hope it is something that can bring us together, definitely, for sure. We are done. We're a little bit over our time, but I do want to thank again Chief Manny Jules from the First Nations Tax Commission and Chief David Jimmie from Squiala First Nation for joining us and sharing your expertise and knowledge in this area. The First Nations Public Service Secretariat is more than happy to continue to provide this platform for information sharing. As I said, this webinar is recorded and will be shared on our website later today. We do have another webinar coming up tomorrow with Indigenous Services Canada. Their town hall, where they're going to be answering questions they're experts in their field. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope you all stay happy and safe, healthy, and that's it. Have a good day.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.